There we go. The things that I'm going to kind of cover today when we talk about feeding performance horses, we're going to start with just looking through the essential nutrients for performance horses, which of course are the same nutrients that all horses require, which will be water, vitamins, minerals, protein, and energy. But there are some differences in feeding performance horses we want to be sure that we're aware of, so that we make sure, especially when you're working these horses hard, that we meet all the nutrient requirements that take care of maintenance requirements, as well as the increased requirements to support the work that the horses are doing. And then one of the biggest and the most difficult nutrient requirements to meet in performance horses is actually energy. So we're going to focus a little bit more on energy than on the other nutrients. And we're going to talk a little bit about making sure that you are feeding the right fuel for the performance that your specific horse is actually doing. And that's going to include looking at fuel for aerobic activity, anaerobic activity, and also look at a little bit the energy partitioning in the feed that you feed, so that you make sure that you have the right fuel for the type of exercise your horse is performing. And then finally, I'm just going to cover a little bit about feeding management, because as always with horses, we know they're kind of fragile flowers when it comes to feeding management. So I'm going to give you just some basic tips for good feeding management, because we want to keep our horse's gut healthy throughout whatever they are doing, whether they are competing, they're hauling, or they're just hanging out being pasture potatoes. We still always want to keep that gut healthy. So starting in, the primary dietary goals when we're feeding performance horses is to provide nutrients and, of course, calories to, number one, maintain condition and replenish the energy reserves in the muscle, because as horses exercise, obviously they're using calories, and the things that happen, they use up the fuel that's stored in their muscles. So we want to make sure that we feed to replenish those energy stores. We also want to support tissue growth, because sometimes we're working these younger horses hard and they're still growing. So we want to make sure that we've got the nutrition for tissue growth and adaptation, because as horses working, there's adaptation, muscular, skeletal, the respiratory system. All those systems in the horse's body have to adapt to support the exercise. And every time the horse exercises, muscle tissues are damaged. So we have to make sure that we have the nutrients to support repair of those tissues. And if you're hauling down the road and you've got the horse working, for days in a row or weeks in a row, you want to make sure those nutrients are in there to support optimal repair, so that I'm sure all of you have had situations where the horse gets to the point where he's just not bouncing back as quickly as you would like. And so supporting that repair can help the horse with bounce back, so that they can provide optimal performance, week after week for as long as possible. And then we also want to provide the energy sources to optimize the fuel use during exercise. So we're going to talk about that quite a bit with the energy partitioning. And as I mentioned, the sound feeding management to support the healthy GI tract and also minimize risks of digestive disturbances. So to start with the nutrients, the first nutrient is water. And water, everybody knows horses have to have water, but that is actually, I'm not going to say the most important nutrient, but the lack of water is going to affect a horse's physiology and performance quicker than the lack of any other nutrient. So it's very important to make sure that the horse has adequate water. Basically, when we want to provide clean, fresh water pretty much all the time, as much as the horse wants to drink. Now, there are times when you've been working the horse really hard. The horse comes off from work, he's hot, he's sweaty. And the recommendation there is don't just stand the horse and let the horse drink all the water that he wants. But quite honestly, in my opinion, it's not so much that the intake of water is a problem as it is the horse just working, coming, standing still, being tied up, and then drinking water. And I think that's really why the recommendation is to keep moving the horse, walking, cooling down, and let them drink water and then move and drink water and move, and don't let them just stand there and drink and drink and drink. So that allows the horse to take in the water. It also allows the horse to keep moving and let those muscles cool down for the most healthy cool down we can give them. Now, to keep the water intake in mind, we've got to remember that it does vary first by a horse's body weight. A larger horse is going to tend to drink more water than a small horse. Also by sweat loss. And the sweat loss is going to be caused either by the exercise, because sweating is a horse's primary method of dissipating the heat. And when the horse is working, those muscles are actually producing a great amount of heat that they've got to dissipate. So for horses, sweat loss is the major means of heat dissipation. And so exercise will generate heat. And then, of course, if the weather is hot, then it's harder for them to lose heat by, for instance, evaporation of the sweat. So they're going to have more sweat loss there. And then humidity also increases the sweat loss. And horses' sweat loss is actually very different than human sweat loss. Number one, with horses, since it's the primary method of heat dissipation, they sweat a lot compared to humans. And also their sweat is more concentrated in electrolytes compared to humans. And finally, in humans, as the humans work longer and sweat more, the sweat becomes less concentrated in electrolytes. And horses don't have that same sort of mechanism. So their sweat is more concentrated in electrolytes to start with, and it stays more concentrated than human sweat. So horses lose a lot of water through sweat. They also use a lot of electrolytes, and we'll touch more on electrolytes when we get to minerals. The other thing that affects water intake is the horse's diet. When a horse is on fresh green grass, there's a lot of water in the grass. And so the horse is getting water intake that way. But there are also studies that show that horses on high hay or higher fiber diets actually drink more water. So just it's good to be aware of how much your own horse drinks on a routine basis. And so for a horse just at maintenance in a kind of moderate environment, tends to drink, 1,100-pound horse tends to drink about 4 to 9 gallons per day. But a horse that is working really hard, and especially if they're in a hot, humid climate, can drink more than 20 gallons a day. So again, be aware of your horse's water intake. And if you see some big changes, make sure you notice that. And it may be, if it's a big enough issue, you might want to talk to your veterinarian. And one of the things with horses, if they don't drink enough water, then they also quit eating as much. And then you start having a horse that's losing weight, and it's just a kind of bad downward spiral. So again, make sure you pay attention to the water intake. And as you're hauling the horse down the road, I'm sure some of you have had some issues with water consumption. There are a lot of horses that when they get away from home, they might back off their water, and that's not really something that you want to see. So when you're traveling, you want to encourage the water consumption as much as possible. That may mean if you're making short trips, you might want to take water from home so that they have the water they're used to, and that may help encourage their drinking. Another option would be there are electrolytes that can be added to the water, and that may help flavor the water. So if you do that at home and they get used to the water at home, then again, on the road, the water is going to pretty much taste the same. You can even get flavors to add to the water so that it tastes the same at home as it does when you're traveling. But be sure that you get them used to it when they're at home. So now when if you don't do that when you're traveling, they're not only getting used to the water that tastes different from home, but then it has a flavor that's even more different from home. So get them used to it at home, and then you can continue that through traveling. And I'm sure everybody is aware, you should always offer water to the horses when traveling, when you're actually hauling down the road. And a lot of times horses don't drink when they're in the trailer. And one thing that I like to use when on a big haul is you can soak hay cubes. And again, you want to get them used to it at home. But a lot of times they will eat the soaked hay even on the road. And a product that I kind of have liked over the years, it's hydration hay that I think you can get it online. You can often get it at a Tractor Supply, but those are 2-pound hay blocks that absorb water really well. And most horses really like that hay with the water absorbed. And a lot of times they'll eat that when they're traveling down the road, where they won't, they'll just completely ignore when you offer them a bucket of water. So things to think about water. Next nutrient then would be vitamins. Vitamins, when your horse is grazing fresh green grass, the living green plants can be some very good sources of vitamins, especially vitamins A and vitamin E. But then when your horse, and especially if you're traveling, chances are the major forage you're using is going to be hay. And the vitamin A and E activity in the hay diminishes pretty quickly. As soon as that plant is cut, vitamin A and E activity start dropping. And so if you've got hay that's 3 to 6 months old, you really can't count on those vitamins coming much from the hay. So you need to make sure that you're feeding to support that vitamin intake for those horses that are, well, for pretty much all horses. The other thing, the B complex vitamins, research has shown that there's a decline in B vitamin status in the tissues and blood in horses when they're on dry forage. And now there are B vitamins that are produced by microbial fermentation in the horse's hindgut, but the absorption of those B vitamins in the hindgut is not as high as absorption of B vitamins, for instance, from the fresh grasses going through the upper gut. So we do have higher requirement of B vitamins in working and stressed horses. So it's important to be aware of that and make sure that you are feeding an appropriate feed that is balanced for the vitamins that the horses need that aren't necessarily supplied by the forage component of the diet. Then I also wanted to just mention vitamin E on its own, because vitamin E is a very important natural antioxidant, which helps protect and helps in the repair of muscle tissues of working horses. And that one, as I mentioned, is likely going to be low in your dry forage. But when horses are really working hard, really stressed, sometimes it's even helpful to supplement the vitamin E above that which is available in the feed. So especially if your horse is one that tends to tie up, have muscle disorders, then what you're looking for is an aqueous form of natural vitamin E, because that is the most bioavailable vitamin E supplement. And of course, KER has nano E, which has been very well proven in research for its helpfulness in these stressed, hardworking horses. And I did want to throw a picture in there. It's not really a vitamin, but another excellent antioxidant is coenzyme Q10. And so the supplement available there is nano Q10. Both of those are available through KER. So,
and can you talk a little bit, like you mentioned B vitamins specifically, what do B vitamins do and why is it important to keep those at a good level?
That's a great question. And that answer is way longer than you want me to take, because there are a load of B vitamins. You're all, I'm sure, familiar with thiamine, niacin, riboflavin, and then there's B12, and I couldn't even list all the different B vitamins, but they're very involved. The B vitamins all have different roles in metabolism. So some of them function in enzymes, some of them function in coenzymes, some of them function in metabolism. So again, there are B vitamins produced by the microbes in the hindgut, but and that's probably adequate for a maintenance horse. But for a working horse, since again, on forage, they're probably not getting adequate intake to support all the functions and the stress of hard work. It's a good idea to have the B vitamins in the feed, and a good, well-balanced, fortified, high-quality commercial feed is most likely going to have the B vitamins included in the feed in bioavailable forms. The nice thing about B vitamins is, since they're water soluble, if the horse actually overeats B vitamins, they're just flushed out. They're not vitamins that are ever, not going to say never toxic, but it's very unlikely to have any issue with an overabundance of B vitamins. Another B vitamin I'm sure everybody is familiar with, but may not realize it's a B vitamin, is biotin. So everybody's heard of biotin for horse hoof health. And so that is another, it is just one of the B vitamins. And so that is one that, especially if your horse has pretty poor feet, a feed that is balanced for all the nutrients is going to contain biotin, either added biotin or natural sources of biotins, because a lot of the ingredients provide biotin as well, but to meet the needs of your horse's feet. So that's probably not a comprehensive answer, but again, a comprehensive answer is going to take a lot.
We'll have to have a whole thing on B vitamins one day.
We really could. Okay, so minerals. Now for minerals, and actually as for all nutrients, the requirements do increase with performance. The harder the horse is working, the higher the nutrient requirements are. However, for the most part, the harder the horse is working, the more feed the horse is going to get to provide energy to fuel that work. And as you provide more feed, that's just going to naturally increase the amount of other nutrients, because your feed, instead of 3 pounds a day of feed, you may be feeding 8 pounds a day. So that's that much more of all the other nutrients, including minerals. So for the most part, if you're feeding a well-balanced feed, if you're feeding to meet those the calorie requirements, you are usually feeding to provide adequate minerals for the working horses, assuming you're feeding an appropriate feed, such as a performance feed for performance horses. So again, be sure to choose an appropriate feed, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes as well. But just to go specifically into a few minerals, calcium and phosphorus are macro minerals. So those are minerals that are required in larger amounts than the micro or trace minerals. And there's been a lot of research on calcium and phosphorus, not just in working horses, but for all horses and actually all animals. And calcium and phosphorus are both kind of ubiquitous in the horse. They're both critical for bone remodeling in performance horses, for metabolic functions, for muscle activity. They're in enzymes when the nerve fibers twitch. Anytime there's an impulse in a nerve fiber, especially calcium is involved. So, and we all know that they're in the bones and the teeth. So calcium and phosphorus are as imperative to have not only in adequate amounts in horses, but also in the right ratio. The ideal ratio is about 2 to 1, but there's a little bit of wiggle room there, and that's two parts calcium to 1 part phosphorus. 1 to 1 calcium phosphorus is okay. 3 to 1 calcium phosphorus is okay. They've fed up to about 6 to 1 calcium to phosphorus ratio in growing horses and not seen a problem. When you get less than 1 to 1, which means there's more phosphorus in the diet than calcium, then we do know the phosphorus actually inhibits the absorption of calcium in the GI tract. And so horses then are calcium deficient. And when a horse is calcium deficient, the storage of calcium in the body is in the bone. So the body wants to maintain the blood level of calcium for all these functions. And so if the diet is not providing adequate calcium, then the body starts pulling calcium out of the bone to provide adequate calcium for everything else. And that's an irreversible process. when it goes on long enough, the bone actually kind of gets replaced. That calcium, the mineral matrix, can be kind of replaced by cartilage, basically. And again, it's irreversible. Back years ago, you would see what was called big head syndrome. And that was because these horses, when there was a lot of reliance on like just cereal grains calcium phosphorus ratio is inverted. So if you're feeding straight oats, straight corn, straight barley, those have a less than 1-to-1 calcium phosphorus ratio. And some poorer quality hays actually will have a 1-to-1 or less calcium phosphorus ratio. Good quality hay is usually a good calcium phosphorus ratio, and sometimes can compensate for some of the grains that are not adequate calcium phosphorus. But again, years ago, that was not the case when people fed straight grains and very few fortified feeds. And so you did see this big head where the bones in the skull were kind of decalcified, and that was replaced by, as I said, kind of cartilage. And the cartilage is bulkier. So the horses' heads really did get bigger. And as I said, that's irreversible. So it's not something you ever want to deal with. We don't see it as much anymore, although some ingredients that people like to just use as a top dress or to dilute out their feeds, such as I already mentioned, cereal grains such as oats. But another one, typical rice brands also are a very inverted calcium phosphorus ratio. So if you do like to top dress with a rice brand, make sure you get one that has some calcium added, so it's not an inverted ratio. Okay, still on minerals. The other minerals I always want to talk about with the performance horses, as I mentioned before, were the electrolytes, because they do, electrolyte requirements increase with work and sweat loss, whether the sweat loss is from work or from just being in hot, humid environments. And for a maintenance horse, just offering free choice salt may be adequate. And that may even be adequate if your horse is just in light work. If you just do a little trail riding, the horse is not doing a whole lot, not sweating a whole lot. And if you're in a moderate climate. So, but even if the horse is not working hard in hot, humid conditions, they may be sweating enough that you need to still add an electrolyte and go beyond just a free choice salt or either loose salt or a white salt block. Is there ever going to be enough salt in the feed? Probably not, because if you put salt in the feed at a level to replace what they lose in the sweat, horses are going to tend not to eat the feed. Now they will lick a salt block, but they won't eat the feed. But again, if they're losing a lot of electrolytes in sweat, they're probably not even eating or licking their salt blocks to provide adequate sodium, potassium, and chloride to replace what's lost. So in that case, you're going to want to look for a good electrolyte supplement. And a good supplement is going to include primarily sodium, chloride, and potassium, possibly some other minerals. There's going to be a little bit of calcium lost in the sweat, possibly a little bit of magnesium. But there's some of the electrolyte supplements you find on the market will have a lot of sugar. Couple reasons that may be, there's a thought out there that you have to have sugar in the supplement for the sugar to help the electrolytes be absorbed in the small intestine. That's really not true. The electrolytes are very well absorbed. The other thing is, if your horse won't eat it, sometimes sugar makes it more palatable. But quite honestly, there's really no need to have an electrolyte supplement with a lot of sugar. The best ones are going to be primarily just the electrolytes lost in the sweat. If the horse won't eat it, then you can use a paste, you can add it to the feed. Whether you do daily electrolytes, rely on just the salt block, or just add electrolytes in times when the horse is really working hard and sweating, it's kind of up to you and your horse. If it's a hot, humid environment and the horse sweats a lot, you may want to do daily electrolytes and not rely just on the salt block. And Or if your horse really just sweats when they're performing, then you may want to just save the electrolytes for when the sweat loss is high and rely on a salt block for normal activity. But just be aware of your own horse's needs. And of course, KER has several well-formulated electrolyte supplements. Dr. Joe Pagan, the owner and founder of KER, did a lot of work prior to the Atlanta Olympics when everybody knew these horses were going to be in a very hot, humid environment. And so he formulated some excellent supplements. You can see there the Restore SR and the Race Recovery are two different kind of electrolyte supplement regimens that you can utilize for your horses. Okay, moving on to protein. Protein is really, horses don't have protein requirements, they have amino acid requirements. And amino acids are the building blocks of protein. So each different protein has a different array of specific amino acids. And amino acids in themselves, some amino acids are essential, which means that those amino acids must be supplied in the diet. I'm sure many of you have heard of lysine is considered the first limiting amino acid in horses. We also have threonine, methionine. There are quite a few essential amino acids. Again, they must be supplied in the diet because the horse's body does not synthesize those specific amino acids on their own. Some of the amino acids can be built within the horse's body, but the essential ones cannot. Now, the amino acids are necessary for muscle maintenance because muscles are made to a large extent of proteins. So for working horses, we need the amino acids for the muscle maintenance. We also need them for the repair because, as I mentioned before, anytime a horse exercises, there's muscle tissue damage. And also when the horse is sweating, it's sweating out some nitrogen. So the amino acids actually contain nitrogen. And so those amino acids, that nitrogen will be used to replace the nitrogen lost in the sweat. So for performance horses, now for all horses need protein for all their bodily functions and for, there's not just protein in muscles, there's protein in hair, there is protein in other tissues, there's proteins in blood, there's proteins, amino acids are parts of enzymes. So amino acids are necessary in the diet, but we also want to look at the protein in the diet, not only having enough protein in the diet, but it has to be the right quality protein. When we talk about quality and protein, we're actually referring to the specific amino acids provided by that protein. And so a high quality protein source is going to provide adequate essential amino acids to meet the horse's needs. In general, the highest quality protein sources for horses, the plant protein sources that are considered the best quality would be soybean meal, and then canola meal is almost as high quality as soybean meal. And then alfalfa. Alfalfa is still considered a quality source of protein, but it doesn't quite have the amount of the first limiting amino acid lysine as soybean meal and canola meal do. And then another very, very high quality protein is milk protein. You don't see milk protein utilized as much in horse feeds because, number one, it's a very expensive source of protein. So most horse feeds, you're going to see soybean meal as the primary source of high quality protein. And secondary, you may see some alfalfa in the horse feed as a good quality protein source. The other thing to think about when you're looking at horse feeds is it's not just the percent of protein in the feed. Once we've gotten past the quality, we want good quality protein, but then the percent of protein, because a lot of people get hung up on that and say, oh gosh, 12% protein, 14% protein. several years ago, there was some research that came out that said performance horses actually only need about 10% protein in their total diets. And people saw that and said, oh, wow, I got to back off on this 14% protein because that's too much protein for my horse. That's not true at all, because remember, I said 10% protein in the total diet. And that's including the forage and the feed portion of your performance horse's diet. And a lot of forages, if you're feeding a typical grass hay, that hay may only have, average of 8% protein. And I live in Kansas, and I see a lot of the grass hays around here because a lot of times the growing season is such that we don't get the hay cut until the plant is quite mature. And I see hay that's fed to horses that's 4 to 5% protein. And that's one of those things, unless you have your hay analyzed, it can be green and it can smell so good, and it can really be poor in nutrient quantities. So you want to make sure that the feed provides adequate protein to compensate what is most likely missing in your forages. So yeah, a 14% performance feed is absolutely not out of line at all. Depending on how hard your works and also how much feed you're feeding. For a performance horse, you're going to tend to be looking at a 12 to 14% feed. But if your horse is a really easy keeper and you can't feed a whole lot of feed because they gain too much weight, that's when you look at those ration balancers, which can be anywhere from 28 to 32, 33% protein. And people may say, oh my gosh, that's going to make my horse's head explode. It's not, because the feeding rate is only 1 to 2 pounds a day versus that 14% performance feed. The minimum feeding rate may be 4 pounds a day for the 1,000-pound horse, and you may be feeding 8 to 10 pounds a day. So think about your feeding rate, because the horse's protein requirements are not in percents. The horse actually requires so many grams of protein per day per pounds of body weight. So if you think about a 32% protein ration balancer at 1 pound a day, that's only about 1/3 of a pound of protein, versus if you've got a 14% feed and you're feeding 4 pounds a day, that's actually closer to about 1/2 pound of protein. So you got to look at the percent and the feeding rate and how that is designed to make sure that your horse has got adequate protein. Now, are there problems if the horse gets too much protein? Usually not. Usually, if the horse gets a little more protein than it needs, it does have to flush out some nitrogen in the urine. But it's and you might actually smell horses on alfalfa. You may have noticed in the winter when the barn's closed up, you smell that ammonia. That's because there's quite a bit of protein in that alfalfa that's not getting digested as amino acids, and it's getting broken down into nitrogen and a carbon skeleton. And the nitrogen is flushed out in the urine as ammonia. You're smelling the extra protein. And if you have poor ventilation, that might be a problem. But usually, again, if the horse is drinking enough water, good ventilation, they flush it out, it's not really that big of a deal. If a horse is protein deficient, then you have problems, because then you're losing muscle activity. The horse is not being able to repair muscle as well. And all the functions that require these amino acids may be compromised. So pay attention to the protein in your horse's diet. And now I'm going to spend more time on energy, because of all the nutrients for working horses, the energy sometimes is the toughest one to actually meet that requirement. And calories are energy. So when I'm talking about energy, I'm talking about the nutrient and not, how much energy, how hot your horse is. We're just talking about the calories your horse requires to maintain adequate body condition and to fuel their exercise. So calorie is a unit of measurement for energy. And the best tool you can use to make sure your horse's energy requirements are met is that body condition scoring system, which we've talked about in several of these webinars. If you're not familiar with body condition scoring, you can go to the KER website, KER.com, and there's a nice chart that helps you learn how to body condition score your horse. but that's just a tool that you use to measure if your horse is fat, thin, or just right. And so it's a scoring system. It runs from 1 to 9. 1 is emaciated, 9 is extremely obese, and in general, we want the horses to be at about a body condition score of 5, which is moderate. And again, you can look at the KER website and learn the body condition score if you're not familiar with that. So we've got 3 sources of energy, or 3 sources of calories in our horses' feedstuffs. Those 3 sources are carbohydrates, which would include structural carbs, fibers, non-structural carbs, which are sugars and starches. So carbohydrates, and then we have fats, and you're familiar with fat is fat. There are vegetable fats, there are animal fats. You're not going to usually see animal fats used in horse feeds, although I got to say, a lot of the early research in feeding fats to horses was done at Texas A&M, which is where I got my graduate degree. And yes, I fed fats to horses, and all that early research, we were using rendered animal fat. So boy, it did not smell very good, but it doesn't really hurt horses. It's not as palatable, and you're not going to see animal fats used in horse feeds, but that is another source of fat. And then protein is also a fuel source because, as I mentioned, excess protein is broken down into nitrogen and a carbon skeleton. And then that carbon skeleton is actually used as a fuel source. However, it's a very inefficient fuel source, and it's a very expensive fuel source. So we want to feed enough fuel as carbs and fat to meet the horse's energy needs, and save that protein to meet the amino acid needs of the horses. We don't want to buy protein to fuel the horse. So I'm going to move into the 2 types of exercise, because the fuels that you use to fuel aerobic versus anaerobic exercise are different. And so when you're looking for a feed to meet your horse's performance requirements, it's good to recognize whether your horse is exercising primarily aerobically or primarily anaerobically to make sure that you have the right fuel for each type of exercise. Aerobic exercise is basically long, slow distance work. And when I say long, slow distance, that's not always at a walk, because endurance horses, which are trotting a lot of the time and clipping along at a pretty good rate, that is also considered aerobic exercise. But it's low to moderate intensity, and the fuel source for aerobic exercise is primarily fat. Anaerobic exercise, on the other hand, is maximal intensity and short duration. I tend to describe anaerobic exercise as short bursts of power and or speed. The fuel source for anaerobic exercise is primarily glycogen. And glycogen is a fuel that is stored in the horse's muscle tissue and also in the liver. And it is a polysaccharide, and the substrate that is used to build glycogen in the body is sugar, primarily sugar or glucose. And so where does the glucose come from that builds glycogen? It comes from the non-structural carbohydrates, or the starch and sugar in the horse's diet. The fats that are used to fuel aerobic exercise comes from the fat in the horse's diet. There is some natural fat in most of the typical ingredients in a horse's diet. Forages do have some small amount of fat. Oats have some fat. Corn has a little bit of fat. So there's naturally some fat in the horse's diet. And so we're not just relying on added vegetable fats such as soy oil or such. So again, dietary non-structural carbs, the starches and sugars in the horse's diet, provide the sugar molecules to build glycogen, and the fats in the horse's diet provide the fat source for fuel for aerobic exercise. During exercise, the way the fuels are used are different. So the work duration and the intensity of the work dictate the type of fuel primarily used. Again, aerobic exercise, long, slow distance work, the process of using the the fat is a slower process, but it is very efficient. You get a lot of the units of energy actually within the body in metabolism are ATP molecules. So burning fat in the body, you get very efficient and large amounts of ATP molecules from the fat that is burned. There is, for the aerobic metabolism, there is some glycogen and some loose glucose in the body that are also used as fuel. And the horses that aren't fed added fat may not have sufficient fat stored in the body to fuel adequate aerobic metabolism. So in that case, they're going to burn some glycogen glucose to fuel their aerobic metabolism. And as I said, long, slow distance work, so walk, jogging, trotting, loping, or cantering, those tend all to be anaerobic. I'm sorry, I keep getting myself messed up here. Aerobic activity. The anaerobic metabolism, the process of breaking down the glycogen in anaerobic metabolism is a very fast process, but it's very inefficient. You do not get as many ATPs per molecule in metabolism as you do with aerobic. And there's not as much glycogen stored in the body, so you will run out of fuel. The anaerobic metabolism, there's only really fuel in the body to fuel that exercise for a few minutes versus aerobic. That burn, that very efficient, slow burn can fuel the body for up to hours at a time. So when you think about the different types of performance that your horses are doing, is it primarily anaerobic? Is it primarily aerobic? Western performance horses tend to be primarily anaerobic, the barrel racers. Reining horses, a lot of that is more aerobic. Roping, primarily anaerobic. The pleasure type events, of course, are all aerobic. Thoroughbred racing, sprinting, quarter horse racing, that primarily is anaerobic. Show jumping is anaerobic. If you look at eventing horses, the dressage is primarily aerobic. The cross country, which is a long period of time, if the horse is fit enough, that's primarily aerobic. And then you come back and the show jumping tends to be anaerobic. The thing to remember about fuel use, or the thing to know about fuel use during exercise, is it's never completely one or the other. So when we talk about fuel sources to provide the calories for these different types, anaerobic versus aerobic exercise, whatever the activity is, it's never only fat or only glycogen. And so here's some graphs. The endurance horse, you can see, even though that is primarily aerobic activity, there is still a significant amount of glycogen that is used, as well as a lot of fat. A racehorse, on the other hand, is primarily using glycogen because that's mostly an anaerobic activity, but still a little bit of fat. So there's still some aerobic metabolism going on. But then the Western performance horse is almost all glycogen and very little fat. So having said that, for your Western performance horses, do you need to only feed non-structural carbs to give them the starch and sugar for that anaerobic metabolism? Well, during the barrel race or during the roping, yes, during that period of time, your horse is primarily using glycogen. But is that the only thing you're doing with the horse? If you think about it, what are you doing before you rope? What are you doing before you go in the arena for your show run? You may be out in the pen doing some loping. And in the times prior to the actual event, you're probably doing a lot of fitness training on your horse. And a lot of that training or warming up is going to be aerobic activity. So you have to keep in mind, you're not fueling just for the performance event, just for the show, just for the rodeo. You're fueling for the long haul. So that's fueling for, the times in between the shows and events. So let's first then talk about carbs as fuel. As I mentioned, we have non-structural carbs, which are the starches and sugars in the diet. And then we also have the structural carbs, which would be the fibers in the diet. The non-structural carbs are primarily coming from the grains in the horse's diets. Corn, oats, barley are all pretty darn high in the non-structural, sometimes they're called soluble carbs. Oats are about 50% non-structural carbs. Corn can be around 70% non-structural carbs, and barley is kind of in between corn and oats. Now, the non-structural carbs do provide the glucose, the simple sugar, that is used for immediate fuel. It's also the substrate, as I said, for glycogen synthesis. So to have the glycogen stored in your horse's body, it's got to have adequate sugar and starch in its diet to provide substrate. Again, it's the main fuel for anaerobic work. The non-structural carbs are very highly digestible. However, if you overfeed like too much grain in a meal, the soluble carbs, non-structural carbs, we want to be primarily digested and absorbed in the upper gut, in the small intestine, where it's broken down and digested as glucose. If you feed too much in a meal and you get an overload of the non-structural carbs into the horse's hindgut, where the microbes ferment the feedstuffs, then you can have a problem because the microbes don't ferment the non-structural carbs into glucose. They break them down and they ferment them, and one of the byproducts is lactic acid. And in general, in the hindgut, you have a lot of fiber digesting bugs, but you get a whole bunch of sugar and starch in there, and the sugar and starch digesting bugs suddenly have something to basically eat. And so their populations start increasing. You have increasing lactic acid produced. It drops the pH of the hindgut, and all sorts of ugly things happen in those situations. And that's why when you feed too much grain in a meal to a horse, you can get colic, you can get laminitis. So we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. But we don't want to be scared of non-structural carbs because the horses, especially performance horses, do need some in their diets to help with that glycogen in their muscles and fuel their exercise. The other thing that people worry about with the non-structural carbs is after a meal that has starch and sugar in it, you do see elevated plasma glucose, and then followed by the elevated insulin in the blood, because the insulin is the hormone that is released that helps push the glucose from the blood out into the tissues where it's going to be used. Now, that's a normal process in metabolism. Some horses, however, can become sensitive to this elevated glucose, and the insulin actually loses its activity. And that's when we hear about insulin resistance, or now it's called insulin dysregulation. So if you have a horse that is very sensitive to soluble carbs, non-structural carbs, then you really have to look at the sugar and starch level in your horse's feed and in your horse's total diet. The other thought is, do you have a horse that gets hot if it's on a high sugar starch diet? And there is a lot of anecdotal evidence of horses that get high on high levels of grains in their diet. Personally, I have not had that experience. My horses, doesn't really matter the level of soluble carbs that I feed them, but my horses are turned out for many hours a day and are worked regularly. And I think a lot of times with these hot horses, work and turnout can really level out their mental state. But I'm not going to say that there aren't horses that are sensitive to soluble carbs as far as their mental activity. So if you're on a horse that does get too hot, Something to look at would be the total starch and sugar in their diet and try to find a good middle ground, because on your Western performance horses, you also want to have a horse that has enough energy to get in there and run for you. And if you reduce the sugars and starches enough in the diet, there is evidence that if they're not getting enough to fuel that glycogen, then they may not have the energy to do the work you need them to. Now, fibers, the structural carbohydrates. Fibers are primarily from the forage portion of the horse's diet. And naturally in nature, the calories from forage are usually adequate to fuel maintenance activities. And some horses are so efficient at using fiber calories that they can stay, a perfectly adequate body condition, or sometimes get fat just on the calories from forage alone. But forage does not supply as many calories per pound as the non-structural carbs do. So for a hard keeper or a hard working horse, they may very well not get adequate calories just from forage. The calories that are coming from forage, even though forage the fibers are made of sugars, just like starch is, the fiber is not digested in the upper gut the way starch is. The fibers go on down to the horse's hindgut where the microbes ferment the fibers. And the fibers are not fermented into glucose, they're fermented into volatile fatty acids, and those VFAs are absorbed from the hindgut and are used as an energy source. The fiber is also very necessary for normal hindgut function. Having the fiber in the diet helps move feed on through the horse's entire digestive tract. And the fiber is also the main source of nutrition of calories for the microbes in the hindgut. So you have to have adequate fiber for the horse to have a healthy gut. So that's one of the big reasons that forages are always the base of the horse's diet. Now, fiber cannot support a maximal workload. As I said, the forages usually don't have as many calories per pound as does grain and certainly fat, but also the VFAs really cannot be synthesized for the most part into glucose. There are a few VFAs that can go to the liver and be remodeled into glucose, but not enough to refill the glycogen storage that you need for anaerobic metabolism. So a horse that's working hard needs more than just forage to supply the fuel that they need for work. Now, so that's all the carbohydrates, and now we'll move into fats as fuel, because remember, fat is the primary source of fuel for aerobic activity. Fats are highly digestible. Many of them are very palatable. The vegetable fats tend to be more palatable than the animal fats. The fats also contain essential fatty acids because fats are made up with fatty acid building blocks, just like proteins are made up of amino acid building blocks. And so there are essential fatty acids that must be present in the diet that will help support the hair coat, skin condition. And I'm sure y'all have heard of the omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, and those are very important in their role in oxidation, in inflammation, and of course, just things, again, the hair coat and skin condition. But fat also, once more, is a primary energy source for aerobic metabolism. When you start feeding added fat to the horse's diet, there is a metabolic adaptation period for the body to efficiently use dietary fat as a fuel. In the natural state, and the horses are eating primarily forage, there's a little bit of fat in that forage, but not a great deal. So when you get to the point where the horse is eating, for instance, a feed that has, you can find 10% or even higher added fat to a horse's feed. And for the horse to be able to utilize that level of fat, it takes some time for them to build the metabolic processes to efficiently use that fat as fuel. What you will see with horses that are on fat supplemented diets, they do tend to have increased stamina because that aerobic activity, that fat is such a good fuel. It is long, slow burning, so the horse can work longer. The other thing you see is that if fat is available to use as a fuel for aerobic activity, then the glycogen is spared, is saved. So the horse is burning fat during the aerobic phase of its activity, and then it gets to the point where it's got to throw out those bursts of power or speed, and there is still glycogen to support that. The other thing to know, though, about fat is it cannot be utilized as a substrate for glycogen synthesis. Glycogen is built out of sugars, and fat is not ever converted to sugars. So something to be aware of when you're really making sure, looking at your horse's diet, still always has to have some non-structural carbs so that you can rebuild the glycogen stores. So choosing a feed, that is the next part. You've got all this information on fuels and metabolism. And so, okay, what kind of feed? And you go to the store and you're going, oh my gosh, look at all these bags of feed. You want to look for a feed that's designed with fuel sources to meet your horse's needs. And that's when we get into the energy partitioning. What fuel sources are in that feed? Because feeds are going to be designed, you can have a feed that the primary fuel source is non-structural carbs. You can have a feed, the primary fuel sources are fats and fibers. You always want to feed with some non-structural carbs. It's very hard to make a feed that doesn't have any. But when you look at the energy partitioning for anaerobic work, you may be looking for a higher non-structural carb content. So that's going to be a higher level of grain-based ingredients. If you're looking at a horse that is primarily doing aerobic work, then you can look at higher fat and fiber ingredients with a more moderate non-structural carb content. If you have a horse that is very sensitive to non-structural carbs, then you got to really balance out, because you want to look for a feed that's lower in non-structural carbs. It's going to be higher in fat and fiber, but you also, again, want to make sure that depending on what kind of performance your horse is doing, you're providing adequate fuels. And then, of course, you got to find the calorie level to fit your particular horse, because if you've got a really easy keeper, then the higher fat feeds tend to be higher calorie. And so you may not be able to feed a real high fat feed to a really easy keeper. So it's all kind of a balancing act to figure out what you need for your specific horse and your horse's performance level. The other thing to think about is as workload and fitness level increase, number one, you're going to increase the amount of your daily rations. You're going to just feed more feed to give them calories to support their exercise. Or you may want to look at a higher calorie feed so you don't have to actually feed more. You may be able to feed the same level of feed, but it's just got higher caloric density. So you're getting more calories from the same amount of feed. The other thing to make sure is that your forage is good to excellent quality for your hard exercising horses. Because if your forage is low, moderate quality, they may not be getting adequate nutrition from the forage to, again, support that workload. And just to give you a little thought about what you're looking at with energy partitioning, what I'm talking about there is the amount of calories or the digestible energy that is provided by protein, fat, non-structural carbs, and fiber. And these pie charts are actually from two different feeds. And you can see on the one on the right, the one on the top, the orange is the digestible energy from non-structural carbs. The kind of teal is the digestible energy from fat. The green is digestible energy from total fiber. And the gold is the digestible energy from protein. And as I said before, we don't really want to depend on the digestible energy from protein because that's an expensive source. But when you're doing energy partitioning, you have to realize that some energy does come from protein. So if you look at the top pie chart versus the bottom pie chart, on the bottom pie, on the two of them, the digestible energy from protein is about the same. But look at the difference in the teal portion, which is the DE from fat, and the difference in the orange, which is the DE from soluble carbs, the sugar and starch, and the DE from the green, which is from the fat. So the top chart is going to be a feed that is probably more geared towards the anaerobic work, because that's got a lot of digestible energy coming from the non-structural carbs. The bottom chart is the higher fat and fiber feed. So that's going to be geared more towards the aerobic work. So that's what I'm talking about when we start dealing with energy partitioning and making sure that the fuel in the feed that you choose is appropriate for your horse's type of work. And last thing, when you're choosing a feed, if your horse is an easy keeper, most traditional concentrate feeds are designed so that you feed about 0.4 pounds per 100 pounds of body weight. So a 1,000-pound horse needs a minimum of 4 pounds a day to get the protein, vitamins, and minerals that it needs. And there are easy keepers. And the little halflinger there was one of my little lesson horses. And if I fed 0.4 pounds per 100 pounds of body weight, the little dude would have exploded in fat. So in those situations for the easy keepers, and there are performance horses that are easy keepers, and in those situations, you still want to make sure that they're getting adequate protein, vitamins, and minerals. And that's when you might want to look at a ration balancing feed, such as the KER all-phase pellet. And that is also when you're going to be looking at that. Those ration balancers are going to be anywhere from about 28 to 32% protein, but you're only feeding 1 to 2 pounds a day. You're only feeding about 0.1 pounds to 0.2 pounds per 100 pounds of body weight. So the total grams of protein are much less than you think they're going to be, because they're designed to meet nutrient requirements with concentrated protein, vitamins, and minerals. So you can feed very small amounts. That way you're not giving them unnecessary calories to support that weight gain. Or just a vitamin mineral supplement for horses that really aren't doing much for a living and hanging out on pasture or hay and staying fat, and you're not really worried too much about protein content, then a vitamin mineral supplement such as the KER Micromax. And finally, just some feeding management tips so that we can help maintain that healthy digestive tract. We want to feed the horse by class. Make sure you feed the horse for what the horse is doing for a living. Sometimes the performance horses are still growing, so you want to keep that in consideration and make sure that your horse has that your feed has adequate nutrition to support growth as well as exercise. And then feed according to the horse's body weight to maintain appropriate body condition. So make sure when you've got a 1,000-pound horse, you're feeding the appropriate amount to meet nutritional requirements and maintain about a body condition score 5, so they're not too thin, not too fat. We always want to feed adequate forage or roughage, which is a minimum of 1% body weight per day on a dry matter basis. Hay is basically already a dry matter basis, so a 1,000-pound horse needs a minimum of 10 pounds of hay a day just to maintain that healthy digestive tract. And a more reasonable minimum is usually 1.2 to 1.5% of their body weight per day. We want to make sure that we measure our feed and our hay by weight, not volume. So you make sure that you know how many pounds of feed and how many pounds of hay, not how many scoops or quarts or any kind of volume measurements. Everything is measured in pounds. And to make sure, or at least reduce the risk of an overload of non-structural carbs into the hindgut, in general, we say a maximum of 0.5% of the horse's body weight in grain in one meal. And that's about 0.5 pounds per 100 pounds of body weight. So a 1,000-pound horse, that's a maximum of about 5 pounds of feed in a meal. Now, if it's a lower starch feed, you actually can feed more than that in a meal without worrying that you're going to overload the gut, the hindgut. and increase the risk of colic and or laminitis. Feed small amounts often because that is the most efficient way for your horse to extract nutrients from its feed. And that's the most natural way. Horses are designed as grazing animals. So there's little bits of feed, forage going through their gut all the time. And that's when the gut is the most happy and the horse is the most efficient at getting the nutrition. And as we all know, with horses, they don't handle changes well, especially when you're making changes to the feed, anything in their ration. Make those changes gradually to allow the microbes in the hindgut to gradually adjust to the new feeding regimen. Whether that is the feed itself or it may be a change in forage. There was a study at Texas A&M several years ago that they evaluated the increasing risk of colic, and the number one risk factor they found was a change in forage. So, and a change in hay. So that is not something people usually think about, but when you do change hay sources, it's a good idea to get your new hay before you run out of the old, so you can feed a flake of the old and a flake of the new and let them gradually adjust. So again, gradual changes. The bigger the change, the longer time you want to take. If it's a small change, like a small change in feed, you can make that change in 3 to 4 days. Big change, you may want to take 10 to 14 days to get them changed over. But all those things will help keep the horse's gut happy and healthy and reduce the risk of digestive disturbances. So take-home messages. Choose a feeding program that provides all the essential nutrients to support your performance horse, whatever the type of performance it is, and whatever your horse's metabolic needs are: easy keeper, hard keeper, average keeper. Provide adequate water to meet your horse's needs. Provide electrolytes. In general, for horses not working hard, not sweating a lot in a temperate climate, free choice salt at least, and then supplement with electrolytes as needed. Feed to provide appropriate fuel or energy sources, and practice good feeding management. So final take-home messages. The WPRA members get 10% off KER products online. Go to KER.com. You can order whatever you want there. Get 10% off with the code WPRA 2021. And I know it's 2022, but KER set up that code to go for 2 years. So that's good through the end of 2022. And then there is a May promotion this month, 15% off the Hoof and Coat collection with code STRONG22. And that would include BioBloom PS, EO3, and Total Wellness. So those are available at 15% off this month. And I want to thank you guys for your time and attention if you've lasted all the way through. And if you've got any questions, I think we can take a few minutes and answer some questions. And if you have questions after we're done, if you send them to Hannah, we'll be happy to answer them. Or you can go directly to KER. Our website again is KER.com. You can email us or you can call us, and we would be happy to answer any questions you have to help you support your horses.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. That was a lot of great information. And like I said, even if you're not a barrel racer or a roper, you can use this for anything. I did have a couple questions come in.
Okay.
If I were to use like a paced electrolyte, during a weekend when I'm, out competing or whatever, is there a certain time of day or a certain time using it around when I'm competing? When would be best to administer that paste?
Very good question. And what I would recommend is, of course, the KER electrolyte products, and those lay out really the regimen to utilize. And for instance, the race recovery, there are 2 products, and there's one that you use prior to, and then you come back after, I think it's within 30 minutes after the race, and come back in with the electrolyte to replenish immediately. And that not only helps replenish what was lost in the sweat, that also helps in having a quicker recovery. So yeah, I would suggest, because products are going to be designed differently. So whichever product you use, follow the feeding instructions on those products.
Perfect. Okay. And then we spoke about, forage and having, an excellent quality forage along with some of the, grain and stuff that you're using. By excellent quality forage, what does that mean exactly? Or what are we looking for in a good quality forage?
We're going to need to have a webinar on forages.
In 2 minutes, what
Yes,
do you look for?
in 2 minutes. Okay. So you, of course, can get a forage analysis run. And if you have something analyzed, I usually recommend Equine Analytical, which is up in Ithaca, New York, and they get forage samples from all over the country. They do a really great job on analyzing. And one of the things I look at on a forage analysis is actually the relative feed value. And for a grass hay, if you've got a relative feed value of about 80 and above, you're looking at a good quality forage in that case. If you don't have your hay analyzed, then basically you're looking, when you're smelling the hay and feeling the hay, you're looking for indications that the plant was cut when it was fairly immature, because the more mature the plant is when it's cut in hay, the lower quality that hay is. So you want that nice green look, you want a nice fresh, good smell. But one of the big things, you want to feel it, because you want it to be pliable. When it gets really prickly and sticky, that's usually an indication that the plant is more mature, because it gets more fibrous and the stem basically gets more woody. So you want that nice pliable stem. You want a high leaf to stem ratio. Even if it's a grass, you want to see, coastal Bermuda grass is kind of tough because those are such tiny little blades in the first place, but you still want to see as much leaf on that blade as possible. You don't want to see a lot of seeds in it, because the seeds develop when the plant is more mature. So a few seed heads and blooms, and just indications that the plant was immature when it was cut.